In this tutorial, we're going to discuss how to control supersaturation during a simulation. So I'm going to start by showing you a simulation of a calcite crystal, and the tab which we're interested in here to demonstrate is the supersaturation profile tab to begin with, which looks like this, and you'll see some radio buttons at the top. The first two asks you, do you want any excess supersaturation of any component, and we'll come to that later on in this tutorial. So for now we'll just say no there, and then later on I'll show you, if you put yes here, what that means for the calculation. Then there are a number of supersaturation modes by which you can choose, or I'll also show you later on how you can do pretty much any profile that you want to. If we just look at supersaturation mode 1, there's a little graphic here that sort of shows you what is going on during the process. So during this simulation you'll start at some high supersaturation, and then you will come down towards equilibrium. If you go to mode 2, you'll just be at some constant supersaturation. Could be supersaturation, could be undersaturation as well. Mode 3 will grow for some constant supersaturation, and then will come down and approach equilibrium. Mode 4 just gets more complicated, a constant level of supersaturation, then achieves equilibrium, and then come to a new saturation, or supersaturation, or undersaturation, as you choose. 5 is just two constant but different supersaturations. 6 is two constant supersaturations followed by an approach to equilibrium, and 7 is 3 different supersaturations but constant. So let's start by looking at mode 3. So that was where we have some constant level of supersaturation followed by approaching equilibrium, and let's just do a calculation there. So let's first of all set the delta mu1, which is the level of this supersaturation. So for calcite, which is a net type of simulation, if that says 0, that means we are very close to equilibrium, and anything positive there would be supersaturated, or negative would be undersaturated. So let me, for example, put a supersaturation of, say, 4 kilocalories per mole in there. Then we want the length of this first period here, I1, how many iterations you want for that period. I'm going to do a total simulation of 2 million iterations, so let's have the first 1.5 million at the high supersaturation, and then the last 500,000 will achieve equilibrium, but you also need to put in approximately how many iterations you want this period here to achieve equilibrium. It won't be exact, but it'll be approximately what it will be. So it's like a time constant, if you like. So I'll put in 100,000 there. So it's going to go for about, well, it will go for exactly 1.5 million iterations at 4 kilocalories per mole, and then it will achieve over the next 100,000 iterations equilibrium, and then for the last 400,000 iterations it will remain at equilibrium, and we'll just get rearrangements at equilibrium. So I'll just set up the simulation options here. We'll put in that we want 2 million iterations. I'll make a movie of this as well with 50 frames. And I'm starting off in this particular simulation from a checkpointed file which I've recorded earlier on. So there we'll run Crystal Grower. And that will run through the 2 million iterations. Fast forwarding to the end, we've now recorded the 50 frames and the simulation is complete. If we then go into Avito and open up the file which we've just recorded there, then we have this simulation, and if we just run through the movie of the simulation, we can see that at the beginning the crystal is growing at 4 kilocalories per mole, so it's growing quite rapidly, and then towards the end of the simulation you'll see that the last quarter, it's at this point here now, it's dropping down towards equilibrium, and you're getting Oswald ripening. You can just stop that and play it one frame at a time. So at that point there you're getting the Oswald ripening going on at the end. Let's see that one more time. So as we've got fast growth, and then we go frame by frame until we get about 3/4 of the way through, 1.5 million iterations. Now you're getting the Oswald ripening occurring as we come in towards equilibrium, and then you just get rearrangement at equilibrium. If you go and look at the output files for that simulation, then if you go and have a look at this file here called del mu, then you'll see what's actually happening to the supersaturation. So we start, if you look at this last column on the right here, we start at a supersaturation of 4, and then as we go through the simulation, just go down this file, for the first 3/4 of it that stays at 4, and then you start to see the supersaturation dropping down towards equilibrium, which is close to 0, and then you're just getting rearrangement as the supersaturation has dropped down close to 0. So the del mu file is quite a good way to interrogate what is going on. There are actually 4 columns of data in total. The first column here is essentially a time for the simulation. The last 3 columns refer to the supersaturation of different units within the structure file. So if we just go and have a quick look at the structure file that has been used for that calculation, which is here, then we see that in the structure there's a carbonate ion, there's 2 carbonate ions, and there are 2 calcium ions. But because in this particular simulation I've actually asked for different species to be grouped, that's this question here on the simulation options, that means it's grouping the calcium and the carbonate together. So the carbonate is one species and the calcium is one species, and these last 2 columns here actually refer to the supersaturation on the calcium and supersaturation on the carbonate. In this case they are equal to one another, and this second column here gives the overall supersaturation. Okay, so let's suppose that now I actually want to find the supersaturation at which we begin to nucleate steps on a certain facet. So I want to step up the supersaturation, starting close to 0 and then stepping up in a number of steps. What I could do is I could use, for example, mode 7, where I can get 3 different supersaturations, and I could apply that. But let's suppose I wanted more than 3 supersaturations, wanted multiple supersaturations. In that case, the best way to approach the problem is to set this into constant supersaturation and set the supersaturation here to 0, and then use this box here where we give an excess supersaturation for a component, and when we put yes there we get this extra tab called excess supersaturation. Now we can have as many periods as we want, so let's just for example have say 4 periods of excess supersaturation. Now these supersaturation components are going to be added to whatever is in the supersaturation profile, and that's why I've made the supersaturation profile constant at 0, because everything I put in the excess supersaturation is going to be added to this. and I can only add to this, I can't subtract, I can't come under this, it's an excess supersaturation, so I can only come up from this value. So you should always set this value below the lowest supersaturation or at the lowest supersaturation that you want. So I've asked for 4 modes, and then you're going to have to say where those modes are. So let's again go with 2 million iterations, and we'll make each one of those 500,000 long. Therefore the first set is going to end at 500,000. The second set will end at 1 million. The third set will end at 1.5 million. And you don't have to put the end for the final set because it will end at the 2 million, the total number of iterations. So you only have to put 3 end periods, although there's 4 periods of excess. You then asked for the excess, this will be in kilocalories per mole, for both carbonate and calcium in periods 1, 2, 3 and 4. So let's, for example, make this, we'll keep them both the same as each other. Let's have 1 kilocalorie per mole, 2, 3 and 4. What you can also see here is that using this excess, we could make the excess for, say, calcium greater than carbonate, or vice versa, if you're putting extra carbonate or calcium into your mix, and then you can actually see what happens if you start to have a higher driving force for calcium rather than carbonate, or vice versa. So again, we'll do a simulation with 2 million iterations, and we will make a movie of that. So off we go. And fast forwarding to the end, we complete that simulation. So if we open up that simulation in Avito, here it is, and we run the movie, we can see at the beginning getting almost no nucleation, and then as supersaturation get higher, we get more and more nucleation. So starting at the beginning, for the first quarter, we've got supersaturation of 1 kilocalorie per mole, almost no nucleation. Come to 2 kilocalories per mole, a little bit going on. Every so often you get something nucleating. By the time you get to 3, now you're getting some surface nucleation going on. Then finally we get to 4, we're getting a lot of surface nucleation going on. Okay, so now if we want to have a look at the effect of changing the concentrations of calcium versus carbonate, we could just put this down to 1 excess period, and then we're going to, say, put a higher driving force for calcium than we are for the carbonate. In the supersaturation profile, I'll leave this as constant supersaturation, and now rather than having this was previously set at 0 before, I'll just give a slightly positive driving for overall driving force. So those excesses will be relative to the 1. So what we will have for carbonate will be 1 kilocalorie per mole, for the calcium will be 10 kilocalories per mole, and we'll run that. That simulation is now being completed. So now if we go into Avito, look at the simulation, and we run that simulation, and we can see that as we run the simulation, we begin to develop different facets. These other facets begin to become more pronounced. And if we just turn off the color coding there, so we're just going to color those according to particle type. So just stop that a second, turn off the color coding there. So now we're just color coding according to particle types. The carbonate is red and the calcium is this yellow color. You can see that the facets which we're developing here are the polar facets, which are just covered in the more or less purely in the calcium, whereas the previous facets which we had here are the ones which have a stoichiometric amount of calcium and carbonate in, and now we're forming these polar facets in the crystal. And you can see there one on the top there, one of these polar facets being formed as we have an excess of calcium in the system. So far I've been looking at calcite, which is a net type of simulation, but now I want to consider a tile type of simulation. So this needs to be done slightly differently. So we just have a quick look at the energy diagram, which you can find in the chemical science paper which we published, which is essentially what we've just been doing for the net type of crystal, whereby the kink site here in the middle of the energy sites for the crystal of interest defines the chemical potential of the crystal, and we've then been defining a supersaturation relative to that, or it could be an undersaturation if it was below that. And so this has been our zero energy here, and that's the way it's defined on a net simulation. Your zero energy will essentially be where the chemical potential for the crystal is. So anything above zero will be supersaturated, anything below zero will be undersaturated. However, the situation is different for a tile type structure, and here, for example, is an energy level diagram for zeolite A, where there are three different cage types. And in this particular case, what we're doing is something quite different, because here we are looking at the energy of condensation of vertices on particular tiles. So in this particular case, the zero state here is where we have everything in a Q4 state. It doesn't matter which tile we're in. And as we go up the energy levels, we're creating one lack of condensation. That would be going from a Q4 state to a Q3 state. But they are all pinned at the 0 point where everything is in Q4 state, and then each one of these going up a rung on the ladder will be one change from a Q4 state to a Q3 state. So as this is our 0 down here in this case, we actually need to find where essentially the kink site is for this system, where the zero supersaturation is, if you like. And the best way to do this is by actually just running the program, and I'll show you that in a moment, where we run the program to equilibrium and we find where this driving force energy delta mu will drop down and find at the balance point of these energy levels. So that's what we'll do now. Okay, so I'm going to set up a simulation here for zeolite A. So I've read in the tile structure, and in the supersaturation profile I'm just going to do a very quick calculation in mode 3, where I'm going to start at high supersaturation. Doesn't matter how high it is, it's just to kick off the crystal growth, and then I'm going to allow it to fall down to equilibrium. I'm going to find the balance point for this particular zeolite. Now the important thing is that I've set up the tile energies here for this particular system. There are three different tiles, so I've set them with different energy levels. And the important thing is that if you decide to change the tile energies, then the balance point will become different, and so your zero for your supersaturation will be different. So we'll have to repeat this operation if you decide to change your energy scaling. So for this particular energy scaling, I'm going to go into mode 3. I'll start it off at very, very high supersaturation. Doesn't matter, this is just to kick things off for the first half of the simulation, which is 500,000 iterations. I'm going to do a total of 1 million iterations. Then it will drop down to equilibrium over the next 100,000, and I will find the equilibrium point. So if I just run that simulation there, and then at the end of the simulation, which is just completed, I now go and find the output files. So here are the output files, and I go again and look at this del mu file, and if I scroll down to the bottom, we started at 100 and we find that the balance point is about 15.4 kilocalories per mole. So actually this is going to be your zero supersaturation. So anything above 15.4 will be supersaturated, anything below 15.4 will be undersaturated. Okay, so now we can go back to our simulation. We can set up a new simulation, and I'll go into mode 2 here, and I'm going to use my excess supersaturation to actually set up my supersaturations in this case. So what I'll do is I will set the level here mu1 to 15.4, and then anything that I set up in the excess supersaturation will be the actual supersaturation. So in this particular case I'm going to have 4 different periods, generate the fields there, and I'll do, let's do a 2 million iterations in total. So the first 500,000 will be the first section, and then the up to 1 million, and then up to 1.5 million, and I'll run all the tiles at the same supersaturation. So the first section I'll run with an excess supersaturation of 1 kilocalorie per mole, and then 2 kilocalories per mole, then 3 for the next section, and then finally we will set up 4 for the last section. In this particular case I will do 2 million iterations, and I'm actually in this particular case going to start from a checkpointed file which I've recorded earlier, so I'm going to grow this on top of an already grown crystal. So just to recap, I've set the baseline to 15.4 because I know that's the balance point and that's essentially my zero supersaturation. Then I've used the excess supersaturation to set up 4 different periods with different increasing levels of excess. I'll also set this up to be a movie, so take 50 frames in the movie, and then we will run that. Now we can go and look at the simulation in Avito, which is here, and if we run through the movie, we go through the different levels of supersaturation. So let's run through the movie, I'll run through it again. So I'll just run this slightly more slowly so that we can see what is happening in the movie. So I go right back to the beginning and just do it frame by frame from the beginning. So at the beginning you've got nucleation on the 111 facets, that's at 1 kilocalorie per mole. By the time you get to 2 kilocalories per mole, it's really still only on the 111 facets, but by the time you get to 3 kilocalories per mole it begins to take off on the 110 facets now, and then by the time we get to 4 kilocalories per mole at the end, now we begin to see the nucleation on the 100 facets. So the different facets have different thresholds above which you need to get in terms of supersaturation for them to nucleate and then begin to grow, and this will ultimately be reflected in the overall morphology of the crystal at different supersaturations. The last type of structure, which is slightly different and needs to be treated in a different manner, is a metal organic framework, a MOF. Set up a MOF simulation here, and in this particular case you always need to use the excess supersaturation here, simply because the solvent is part of the structure as well as the metal and the linker. So when you set up a MOF calculation, you need to somehow have a way of treating the supersaturation for the solvent as well as the metal and the linker, but the metal and the linker are being used up, whereas the solvent is essentially in massive excess. And the way this is treated in terms of the supersaturation, in this particular case we can see we've set up an excess supersaturation. We have the solvent, the metal and the linker in the structure, and what you need to do is you always need to put the solvent with an excess supersaturation of -1, this doesn't give it a supersaturation -1. It actually always puts it essentially as an activity of 1 because the solvent is not being used up. So always put the solvent as 1, and then you can do whatever you want with the other values. In this case I'm running 2 series, first with a linker in excess, and then in this second period I've got a metal in excess. So if we run that calculation, so at the beginning of the calculation you have the linker in excess. We've got a screw dislocation in this particular simulation. We have these diamond shape terraces, and then as we play that simulation halfway through, you see the switch from diamonds to squares as we've now gone to a metal in excess. But the important thing from the supersaturation point of view is you need to set the supersaturation excess of the solvent to -1.